Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Good evening. Great to see you all. Welcome to the World Over Live. In a little moment, we'll get to so much. We have so many headlines for you. To begin, a terrific show. The first human trials of embryonic stem cell research were attempted this week. We'll explore that and so much more news from the bioethical front. We'll also talk to Father Tad Pacholczyk of the National Catholic Bioethics Center about that. And a little later in the program, Brother Andre Bessette. Who is he? He's scheduled to be canonized this weekend, but many outside of Canada don't know who this great man of God is. We'll talk to a member of his congregation and get clear on exactly who Brother Andre is and his influence around the world. Now, before we do that, let's get to the brief news from the world over this week. A minor miracle, so to speak, occurred this week. Luis Arzua, the last of the 33 trapped Chilean miners, was brought to the surface Wednesday evening, happily ending a 70-day ordeal that captivated the world. Of the countless stories about the miners, very few touched on the faith of these 33 miners. But when the miners were first discovered alive, 17 days after the collapse, some of the first provisions the miners requested were a crucifix and a statue of the Virgin Mary. They dedicated their entire shelter as a shrine. They prayed together nightly, and above ground, their family kept vigil. Votive candles, rosaries, and masses were a constant. Ricardo Villarroel told reporters before, "I never used to pray. Here I learned to pray. I got close to God." 2 conversions were reported, and perhaps best encapsulating the faith of the group, 19-year-old Jimmy Sanchez. He was the youngest of the miners. He wrote a note to the surface Tuesday, just hours before they were all rescued. He said, "There are actually 34 of us because God has never left us down here." An amazing story, and one we are sure to hear much more about. Back in the U.S., another victory for gay rights. U.S. District Court Judge Virginia Phillips issued a worldwide injunction Tuesday, stopping the enforcement of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. The ruling effectively ends, at least for now, the U.S. military's 17-year ban on actively open homosexuals in the military. During the trial, Justice Department attorneys argued that an abrupt change to the policy could hurt military readiness in a time of war, and that Congress should decide the issue, not this judge's court. Judge Phillips disagreed on both counts. On Wednesday, Defense Secretary Robert Gates reiterated the military's concern, saying an abrupt reversal would have enormous consequences for the troops. He said changing the policy is an action that requires careful preparation and a lot of training. And on Tuesday, the Department of Justice appealed a recent ruling that struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, the 1996 law, which defines marriage as a union between one man and one woman under federal law and protects states from having to recognize gay marriages approved by those individual states, was ruled unconstitutional by a federal judge in July. Justice Department spokesman Tracy Schlammer said the Department of Justice is obligated to defend federal laws when challenged in court as a matter of policy. But the president has made it clear that he believes the Defense of Marriage Act is discriminatory and should be repealed. Tuesday's filing came on the deadline day for the Obama administration to appeal the case. And the first human trial using embryonic stem cells has commenced in Atlanta. This past week, Geron Corporation, a small biopharmaceutical headquartered in California, initiated an FDA-approved treatment to a partially paralyzed individual's spine, their spinal cord. Embryonic stem cell treatments are considered highly risky, showing a high propensity for causing cancer in laboratory animals. There is some concern that these effective treatments using adult-derived stem cells for spinal cord injuries have already been documented and had positive results. Dr. David Prentice of the Family Research Council said the experiment showed more concern for Geron stock price than for the health of the patient or the dignity of human life. Much more on this in our next segment. And the Synod of Bishops for the Middle East was convened in Rome on Sunday. The two-week synod is intended to highlight the importance of the faith in the region. It also will look into the difficulties faced in various forms of discrimination and persecution and violence faced by Catholics and Christians in the region. During his opening reflections, Pope Benedict XVI said the Church in that region must combat and unmask the false gods of the day. The Holy Father pointed specifically to what he described as the great powers of today's history. Among them, certain anonymous capitals around the world. He meant capitals of countries. Terrorism, the drug culture, and public opinion. These ideologies, he said, are so dominant, they impose themselves by force as divinities. He said they've enslaved men and threatened the world. Comparing today to early church history, he said Christians must fight against these false gods for the sake of the gospel and the welfare of mankind. Today, as in the past, he said the world needs heroic witness. The problem of religious freedom for Christians in the Middle East is perhaps no more apparent than in Saudi Arabia. Earlier this month, the Islamic Kingdom's religious police raided and shut down a privately held mass and arrested 13 Catholics in the process. The Commission for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, also known as the Mutawa, conducted the raid just as the mass began at a Riyadh hotel. About 150 expatriate Filipinos were attending the mass. A priest was among the 13 arrested. They have since been conditionally released, but face charges of proselytizing, which is punishable by death. Christian worship is allowed in Saudi Arabia, but must be strictly private, and conversion from Islam is legally forbidden. Filipino diplomats are assisting the accused in the matter. And the Pontifical Council for Promoting New Evangelization was officially unveiled at a Vatican press conference earlier this week. Pope Benedict XVI created the new office to address the growing problem of secularization and the eclipse of God in Europe and the West. Archbishop Rino Fisichella will head the new office. During the press conference, he outlined the Holy Father's mandate for the council. They'll be charged with assisting local bishops to propose church teaching to the wider society, employing modern communication tools for the furtherance of the church's message, and they'll mobilize missionary activities using members of religious orders and new religious movements. And finally, an Australian and a Canadian will be among the 6 canonized saints in the Vatican ceremony this Sunday, October 17th. Blessed Mary MacKillop will be the first Australian native ever to be so honored. The much-beloved Australian nun was born in 1842 to Scottish immigrant parents. She took the name Mary of the Cross when she entered religious life. Mary MacKillop founded the Sisters of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart, who teach the poor. Their work spread quickly across Australia in the latter part of the 19th century. Notably, it was the first religious order founded in Australia. She was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1995. Also, Blessed Andre Bessette, founder of St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, will also have his banner hung above St. Peter's Square. More about his life later in the program. And if you find yourself visiting D.C. on a Thursday night, you better come see me. Drop us an email at worldoverdc@yahoo.com. We'll reserve you a place right here in the studio at the John Paul II Center. When we return, Father Tad Pacholczyk is here. We'll talk about these advances or setbacks in bioethics. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. There's been much stem cell research news in recent days. This week, human trials with embryonic stem cell treatments began in Atlanta. And the innovator of the IVF procedure was recently awarded a Nobel Prize for his efforts, and much more. Here to unpack it all, I'm joined live on set by the Director of Education at the National Catholic Bioethics Center, a neuroscientist and one of the foremost experts in the realm of bioethics, Father Tad Pacholczyk. Father Tad, great to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Let's talk for a moment about, there was a big story this week. A 20-year-old embryo was used to conceive and bear a child this week, apparently.
Yeah, this is a remarkable development because previously, the longest time that they had kept an embryo frozen was about 13 years. And nobody was sure how long we could continue to store them and still get viable children. There's also the issue of storing sperm this way. You can freeze sperm and store them, and the sperm has been stored for up to 30 years and been able to then be used for conception. So, you know, the technology is pretty far advanced, and in a sense, the technology is outpacing a lot of the ethical discussion
so
around these issues.
we crossed a new threshold with this long period of time, 20 years that one can go with using a frozen embryo?
We're not sure. At this point, you know, it could be the case that embryos could actually be stored for 100 years and then be thawed and implanted and gestate a child. We have to just wait and see how this is going to play out. There haven't been any studies done that I've seen that look at how quickly these embryos decay while they're in the deep freeze. That's the question that's on everybody's mind.
Well, and we should talk, there's 1 million frozen embryos estimated.
Actually, it's about 500,000 in the United States.
But around the world?
Around the world, it's definitely up around 1 million. Yes, it's many more.
And has that, you mentioned a moment ago that this ethical conversation really hasn't taken place, that it's outpacing, the technology is outpacing the conversation. What will it take to have that conversation?
Well, I think it's going to take some firm insistence on the part of the Church to her own flock that people look at this. I think the Church has a unique position here, a unique voice, and if this doesn't occur within our own household, I think for the rest of the world it's going to be a very hard sell to get a serious ethical conversation going.
And if you have a question, give us a call, 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S., 205-271-2980 internationally, or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. We'll get to all of your questions. Father, I want to go back a little bit. Robert Edwards, who really coined this in vitro fertilization procedure, he was granted a Nobel Peace Prize. Your thoughts, what does this honor mean?
Well, I think the awarding of this prize is rather a surprise from the point of view that the Nobel Committee in the past has, on occasion, given prizes that have later kind of come back to bite them. For example, they gave the prize to the individual who figured out how to do lobotomies on people. This was back in 1949, and there was a great deal of controversy around this. People said this has been used to incapacitate all kinds of people, thousands and thousands of people. This is a highly unethical procedure, and here you are giving a Nobel Prize for it. The IVF procedure has a similar kind of problem. There are ethical concerns that are raised by the technology that are very, very serious, under-discussed, and people are celebrating this as if it were, you know, a wonderful development. The problem here, I mean, we can look at it from many angles, but you have things like the possibility of gays and lesbians using this technology to engender children. You have the possibility of single mothers like Nadia Suleiman having 14 children of their own. And not having a father in the picture to help raise them. These technologies can be used for sex selection. And the way you do that is you make a bunch of embryos, and if you want a male, you just throw away the females. So all of these technologies have these kind of dark sides to them that nobody is acknowledging, and certainly the Nobel Prize Committee has just stepped right around this ethical issue.
Well, I want to play devil's advocate here for a moment. In many of the reportage that I've seen, it says 4 million people have been born using the IVF procedure. Surely that's a pro-life position, so many people will say.
Well, they will say that, but you know, it isn't a truly pro-life technology, and I'll tell you why. Because When you do in vitro fertilization, for example, you make embryos and then you grade them and you throw away the ones that don't look like they're growing well. Is that pro-life to throw away human beings? After you implant embryos, you implant 3 to 5 of them. If several of them take and you get triplets, quads, higher order pregnancies, which is quite common, quite dangerous, a pregnancy, they recommend selective reductions. So again, this is not a pro-life technology. You see that it's actually a two-edged sword, and the death-dealing edge of the sword comes out once this technology is deployed among even 4 million people. One more thing, Raymond, here that's very, very important. When we do in vitro fertilization, for every baby that is born, there are 5 others that were implanted that failed to take, plus maybe another 4 or 5 who never were even implanted. Maybe they were frozen. So every child that's born means 8, 9, 10 other ones are killed along the way, are lost along the way.
Now, many people get into the in vitro racket, if you will, seeking children. They can't conceive otherwise, so they put their embryos on ice. It has created, unbeknownst to them, I think, this market. Talk about the market. What is the need for human embryos now that technology and science is creating?
Well, I mean, the market is going to be in the future the desire to have embryos for stem cell research. Because the argument that's used, and it's a really seductive argument, is these embryos in the deep freeze are being abandoned by everybody. So if they're going to be, quote unquote, thrown away anyway, that's the catchphrase, then we should hand them over to researchers and allow them to destroy them, get these miraculous cures. People will be jumping up out of wheelchairs, supposedly. And so this is the market that, is in the future for this. Now, I mean, there's another kind of market that we can talk about here, which is related to this entire fertility industry, which is the market of surrogacy. There's a huge surrogacy industry that is just blossoming in India, where women there sign the dotted line and agree to raise strangers' embryos, to implant them, gestate them, and then hand them over back to the couples who pay for this. This has become a very, very big industry, and now embryos are being flown overseas through FedEx package service. And there was some recent scandals with this when some of these packages were intercepted in India. So there are these kind of markets as well, markets in the sense that are just driven by the economics of a very profitable, multi-billion-dollar industry, which is what the infertility industry has become. And when it gets that big, it gets doubly difficult to start any kind of meaningful ethical discussion.
Father, to be very blunt here, there's this new Harris poll, and it seems you and the church are on the wrong side of this debate, according to public opinion. Of course, the Pope mentioned, as you heard in the headline segment, public opinion has now become its own idol, if you will. It's become its own divinity in many ways. We see a little evidence of it here. 73% of people in this new Harris poll, all adults, 73% believe that stem cell research should be allowed, quote, as long as the parents of the embryo give their permission and the embryo would otherwise be destroyed. Waste not, want not. Your thoughts?
This is a battlefield of ideas. Clearly, the media has played a very successful role in this. I've been watching the polls over the years, and one of the interesting things to observe is that the pro-life component of the individuals who are asked, they are refining their position and becoming more clearly articulate about the unacceptability of human embryonic stem cell research. But the general public is still largely uninformed. So their responses in many of these polls end up being responses of emotion, that they see a family member who has a disease and they say, of course I want them to be cured. This is a natural desire that people have. So they're acting out of a kind of good impetus or impulse when they answer many of these poll questions.
Father, you're talking about religion, though. 69% of Catholics and 58% of born-again Christians also support embryonic stem cell research for the same reason. 69% of Catholics.
But the same problem prevails there, that even within our own household, Catholics are not well catechized on these issues. So we find ourselves playing a bit of catch-up. I mean, look at in vitro fertilization. This is standard operating procedures. Catholics do it at the same rate as non-Catholics. So when you have that as the backdrop, a largely uninformed electorate, so to speak, then these poll numbers are not surprising. We have a great deal to do to bring people up to speed.
There are a couple of stunning findings in this Harris poll. Almost two-thirds, 62% of respondents said they do not agree that allowing any medical research using stem cells from human embryos should be forbidden because it is unethical and immoral. They do not agree.
Well, that's a frightening, poll result. I think we're, as I said, it's a battlefield of ideas. We're in the midst of that battle. People are, drawn because of the pro-abortion reality that we live in as well. When you have a backdrop of abortion on demand, these questions fit into that context and are part of the same debate that has been going on for so many years.
I got to tell you, I personally, when I read this one finding, it's stark. It takes your breath away. Only 28% of those polled agreed with the following statement. I don't believe that we should put the interests of medical science ahead of the preservation of human life, which includes human embryos. Only 28% of people agreed with that statement.
That's a frightening statistic. I agree. That means 1/4 of the people, 3/4 of the people would put medicine ahead of human life.
But where do you go with this now? Where do you go with this when this is so accepted now? These embryos are obviously thought in the public mind to be a little piece of tissue on the side, certainly not human life.
That's right. This has been turned into a matter that can be manipulated. It's an object for us to use for our own gratification, for our own satisfaction, for developing cures. It's kind of raw material. The embryo has been depersonalized, but all of us were embryos, Raymond, and this is the fundamental truth that has to be brought back to the consciousness of people.
Now, the fact is, it gets lost in all of this reportage, in the poll numbers, in all of this, is that the really successful therapies are by and large, in fact, they're exclusively, adult stem cell research. They're derived from stem cord blood, umbilical cord blood, skin cells, people's individual bone marrow, the placenta. There's no moral or ethical difficulty with adult stem cell research where the great cures are happening. Why aren't we hearing about them?
I don't know why we're not. Maybe because it's old news and people think, well, this is kind of has-been stuff.
But how can it be old news when you see these poll numbers? People are obviously reacting at the promise of cures that embryonic stem cell may or may not be able to provide, but adult stem cells are.
Well, I agree. And, the issue here is that the banks that store bone marrow and umbilical cords, do you know how many people they cured last year? 5,000 people. Do you know how many people were cured last year using embryonic stem cells?
No.
0. Because this clinical trial is the first attempt to actually use these cells.
Let's talk about that.
So 5,000 versus 0, does that get into the news? Unfortunately, it doesn't. People just focus and hype the embryos to a degree that is nonsensical.
JRCon, this company, has branched out. They're doing these first human trials, federally approved trials. What does this mean? And what are the risks?
Okay, these trials are trials that are just looking at safety. So it's directly assessing the question of risk. If you put derivatives of human embryonic stem cells into spinal cord injury patients, can you expect any untoward effects? Maybe tumors, maybe other complications, misbehavior at the site where you make the incision and insert the cells. These are the kinds of basic questions that are going to be asked. These questions, the first questions of these studies are not even looking at efficacy. In other words, will the patient see any improvement here or not? They're not concerned about that because this is the very kind of first step in a long series of subsequent clinical trials that will be required before this would ever be ready for prime time.
Is this just a company trying to bolster its profits, as has been hazarded by some?
I don't know for sure, but I certainly would suspect so. This is kind of science by press release. We often see this, that small companies like Geron, like Advanced Cell Technology, they know the funding is very dicey. They're dealing with highly controversial types of research, and so they need the press releases in order to get new investment funds flowing. They don't have federal funds that they can rely on here.
But Father, if you have technology, as we've seen in recent weeks, where you can dial back the clock on adult stem cells, which makes them pluripotent, very flexible, why do we need to go down this path of embryonic stem cell human trials? At the risk of human life, not only are you destroying the embryonic life, you're risking the walking and talking human life.
Well, I think, Raymond, it's important to be careful not to make a particular error that some pro-lifers make, which is they say, let's compare adult stem cells or let's compare these induced pluripotent cells that you're describing and regular embryonic stem cells. And whichever one works better, well, that's the one that's got to be ethical. Well, the scientist is one who is always pushing the boundaries. He wants to be creative. He wants the next Nobel Prize. Right. He wants the breakthrough. So he has to see the ethics. We need to talk ethics more than we do. We can't just talk efficiency, what works well. You know, that's the first temptation, I think, to make it a kind of more horizontal argument. But we have to reintroduce ethics into science. I always say to people, look, the idea of science without ethics is as crazy as the idea as a business without ethics. You just can't do it. It doesn't work. It's dangerous for all of us, for humanity, for our future. We need science that is, you know, seriously ethical and that doesn't do things, you know, in a way that is haphazard and irregardless of the ethical constraints.
What is an induced pluripotent cell? Is that where you're turning back the clock?
It is where you're turning back the clock. You're taking a cell and you're putting genes inside it which trigger it to go backwards developmentally. So it becomes a simpler, more powerful kind of a stem cell. Now, there was a recent breakthrough in this area that's very impressive because when you did this before, you put these genes in, they interrupted the entire genome of the cell and increase the risk of cancer from these induced pluripotent stem cells. Now there's a new trick using something called RNA where you can avoid that, and these cells are much more stable, much more able to be managed, much less likely to generate tumors.
But the researchers say on the other side, Father, we need this as a barometer. In other words, the embryonic stem cells are invaluable, according to the Washington Post just a week or two ago. The Washington Post says that the embryonic stem cells are irreplaceable for evaluating the adult stem cells. So even if we accept the adult stem cells, we need the embryonic. So we have a barometer here.
Yeah, a barometer, or the phrase that's used is the embryonic stem cells are the gold standard against which we measure everything. Well, this is a very misleading kind of language because, first of all, everything has to be done in animals. And the animal embryonic stem cells are much better understood, much further along. We've studied them since the 1980s. We know a heck of a lot more about them than we do about the human cells. So, you know, this is a misleading type of an argument that is presented to just justify this. But even if it were true, Raymond, there are still ways to get true embryonic type stem cells. For example, from a miscarriage between 5 and 9 weeks of age, if you ask mom and dad for permission to extract cells, germ cells they're called, out of that fetus who died, you can use those cells and they behave in the same way as the ones that you get out of the tiny little embryos. So no ethical lines have to be crossed. We can do research ethically if we put our minds to it, if we take it seriously.
I want to go to the phones for a moment. If you have a question, you can give us a ring or you can drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. The phone number 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S., 205-271-2980 internationally, and worldover@EWTN.com. Tom from Arizona, you're on the World Over Live. What's your question, Tom?
Hi, I've got a question about embryo adoption. You mentioned the argument that pro-embryonic research people use that, you know, these embryos are going to be destroyed anyway, so why not do tests on them? Is there a Christian twist on that argument saying since these embryos are possibly going to be destroyed anyway, should they be adopted by Christian parents who can't have children otherwise? And it's my understanding that the Pope has this issue under consideration. Is that true?
Yeah, what was it, a year ago, there was a statement from the Vatican, but it still left this a little cloudy, yes?
That's right. It was a statement called Dignitas Personae, and it said that you can't do embryo adoption as a way of treating infertility directly, but it did leave kind of open the question of whether you could just do this as a means of rescuing these embryos. So this has not been settled by the Church. It's very actively debated. There was kind of cautionary language, I would say, in this document, kind of a yellow light that was thrown up. And I'm myself, personally, am skeptical that the Church will ever approve this. You know, I think the situation here, we often ask, what should be done with all the frozen embryos? I always say that's the wrong question. The first question we should ask is, how do we stop the assembly line production of these embryos that's going on in every major city in the United States. Because even if we had some Band-Aid, like embryo adoption, which would take care of a very small number, we're still producing these by the thousands every day.
And putting them on
suspended
animation.
Suspended animation. Frozen orphanages. I mean, this is a scandal of the highest order. We need a law like Italy or Germany has, which says when you do in vitro fertilization, you can only make 3 embryos grand total, all 3 of whom must be implanted into their mother by law. No extra embryos can be frozen. You can't experiment on them. You can't hand them over to stem cell researchers. That's a reasonable law. It's not a Catholic law, but it's a reasonable law to kind of limit the collateral damage that occurs here.
What do you think of the Obama administration decision to allow embryonic stem cell research with the permission of the parents?
I think this is a very beautiful fiction in the sense that this jumps around the key issue of what we call informed consent. Informed consent, when it's done by somebody else on your behalf, it means that person has your best interests at heart. Now here, you're asking the parents to hand over their own children for destruction and to sign the dotted line to give permission to do this. A parent can never hand over their own children for directly destructive interventions like that. That kind of
They simply don't have that right.
They simply don't have that right. This is pure fiction. This is a kind of impurity that's entering into the field of ethics, a kind of substitute for the real deal.
Now, there was a Vatican official, Archbishop Streccia, at the Pontifical Academy of Life, who this week said these human trials, whether they bear fruit or not, it is a moral crime. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would, in the sense that the absolute requirement for doing this kind of research is that you destroy human embryos. Human embryos are human beings at the earliest stage of their existence. They're exactly what you and I were. I often say to people, I'm an overgrown embryo, you know, to put it in simple terms. Or I sometimes say, you know, as a former embryo myself, I have strong opinions about how we should treat human embryos. We've got to reconnect with our own origins here. So it is a crime against humanity to push research which requires that we cannibalize our own children.
And it's also the means justifying the end routine. I mean, in
Yes,
the sense
it
of the
is.
IVF. And then you have to make the correlation to this adopting embryos. Isn't that the same mentality? I'm doing a good, I'm going to be rescuing this embryo, so therefore,
I personally believe
this.
that it is. As I say, the church hasn't settled this, but I am convinced that even though the end is good, that you would like to rescue these embryos, the issue is that you have to violate marriage to do this. That a woman becomes an incubator for a stranger's embryo, her husband stands on the sidelines, and you're violating fatherhood that way. You're violating motherhood as well. This is using her procreative powers, her ability to be pregnant, completely separated from the marital act. So this is, I'm convinced, something that we can't do. We can't go down the path of embryo adoption. But that's my opinion, not the formal teaching of the church.
I want to go to the phones again. Mary from Florida, you're on the World Over Live. What's your question, Mary?
Thank you for taking my call. My
Sure.
question is, these little embryos, they are babies, right? I
Yes.
wanted to ask, do they have a soul?
I'm getting a lot of emails like this. Do embryos have souls? Do these IVF-created embryos have souls?
Certainly, the IVF embryos are no different than the regular embryos. All you did was a workaround to produce them. Sperm and egg normally join within the woman's body. Here, the sperm and egg are joined in a petri dish. You wouldn't expect that there would be any kind of difference, and there isn't. I mean, we have 4 million babies, all of whom have souls. There's no question. And the same will hold true, Raymond, if cloning occurs, as I'm sure it's going to in the next few years. We'll have a baby born by cloning. He or she will have a soul. There's no question. He'll look just like you and me, think just like, there won't be any difference, because cloning is a workaround to make an identical twin. I always ask people, have you ever met a pair of identical twins, one of whom does not have a soul? And of course, you never have.
The answer is, of course,
The answer is, of course, not. God respects his biology that he has set in motion, even as if we, as the human agents, misuse the gift of that biology for our own ends and purposes.
A lot of calls from Florida tonight. Philip from Florida, you're on the World Over Live. What's your question, Philip?
Thank you for taking my call. Father, my question is this. If the practice of in vitro fertilization is inherently evil, then because it treats a human being like a commodity, then why doesn't the church take the same stand it does in the question of abortion, which is it is absolutely forbidden for all purposes and all times, etc. And that would seem to avoid being drawn into the secondary and tertiary considerations of technology outstripping ethics. So that's my question.
Good question.
Yeah, good question, Philip. Actually what you said is the case. The church states unequivocally that in vitro fertilization is always a disordered action. It can never be justified. It should never be freely chosen by anybody. It is against reason. It violates all kinds of goods, especially the goods of marriage, but also violates human life in so many of the ways that we've been discussing during the program. The church's position on this is unambiguous. It is precisely as unambiguous as the church's teaching on abortion itself. There isn't any wiggle room here, even though people sort of imagine, out of their strong desire to have children, that there might be some kind of loophole.
A lot of questions, and I want to return to this because we're still getting them. If you say the church is pro-life, why would they deny me the ability to have a child who can't conceive normally, and yet I have a child via in vitro fertilization?
Well, the church certainly doesn't want to deny somebody the ability to have a child, but we never have a right to a child. This is the mistake that gets made. We use rights language as if a child were a piece of property to which we are entitled. Rather, we have a right only to those acts, those beautiful marital acts that are ordered and disposed to handing on that gift. But it's truly a gift. If you insist on the gift, it's no longer a gift. It becomes an entitlement. So there's a very delicate balance here. And, if a person is struggling with infertility, the Lord has another plan. If you're genuinely not able to become fertile and have a child of your own flesh and blood, there is a spiritual journey that the Lord is inviting that couple to. I have a friend who says, when God slams one door closed, He opens another door, or maybe a window. He's got another plan, and you can see this in the sense that maybe He's inviting a couple to adoption. Maybe He's inviting them to become big brother, big sister to others in the community. There are other ways to express this radical male-female complementarity that exists at the heart of marriage.
Here's Rachel from New York. My question is, if an infertile woman does in vitro fertilization for a chance at giving birth, is that considered a sin by the church? It's really the same question we entertained earlier.
It is. Yes, in point of fact, the decision, if you give full consent of the will and you have full knowledge of what you are doing, which actually is very rare. I think most Catholics don't know what they're doing when they do this. But if you did have that, it is grave matter, which means that this would be potentially a mortal sin if all those conditions were satisfied.
After watching this show. They now have full
Hopefully
knowledge.
They have
you see,
greater knowledge anyway,
the problem
with
of watching,
the help of God, yes.
Why don't we start using words like moral sin? Again, this correspondent writes, a term that most Catholics can understand. The Church may always standard that it is intrinsically, that it's always had a standard that it was an intrinsically evil action. But the last time I heard a bishop or priest state this during their homily was, let me see, sadly, never. Mark wrote that from Virginia.
Well, that's an interesting comment, and I'll be honest with you, Raymond, as I was growing up, I grew up in Arizona, went to church every Sunday. I never heard a homily on in vitro fertilization, and I never heard one on contraception either. So I think, he's raising a valid point. We're not preaching the treasures that we have at the heart of our own belief system. These are truths that set men free. These are truths of reason, but we aren't preaching them. We're kind of keeping them under the bushel basket, and we can't. These are important for our own salvation.
There's a great piece of news that did come out on this front that we want to share the good stuff too. In Baltimore, Baltimore's Mercy Medical Center is now opening the first public cord blood bank. How important is this, and what advances have we seen via umbilical cord blood storage?
Well, I think this is pretty significant because part of the arrangement here is they are making sure that all the women who come to this hospital and give birth, and there are many thousands who do this each year, it's a very big hospital, will be offered the option to donate to this public bank. And The key thing is the couple will not have to pay to do this. There will be government funding behind this. Because one of the problems is you can do this privately, but it costs you $2,000 to $3,000, and then you have to pay $300 a year to keep the cells frozen.
Right.
Most couples don't do it. The umbilical cord gets thrown away. It's a shame. It's a waste that happens. So this kind of initiative is great. It is really creative. And it, as I mentioned before, 5,000 people last year were treated using these kinds of cells from umbilical cords and from bone marrow for various blood diseases, for various problems that they had. Adult stem cell treatment is active and moving forward in a remarkable way.
Final question. Tell me about this whole area of placenta also, saving the placenta.
Yes, this is a related area. The placenta is a very large organ and contains many more cells that can be harvested than an umbilical cord would. The umbilical cord, you typically remove just the blood and then get the cells out of it. So you're dealing kind of smaller fries, smaller potatoes here. But you go to the placenta and you get a much bigger reservoir. And this is a whole area of research now. The placentally derived stem cells are being used for some amazing things, including, for example, producing an artificial bladder. So people who have bladder injuries, they can use these placentally derived cells to kind of fix the hole in the bladder. So very exciting developments that are taking place.
Father Chad Pacholczyk, thank you so much for being here.
Great
Always
to be
enlightening and great to have you back.
Thank you.
For more on Father Chad's work and for lots of information on this entire range of bioethical concerns, visit the National Catholic Bioethics Center website at ncbcenter.org. When we return, Father Charles Corso on the canonization of Brother Andre Bessette this weekend, The World Over Live. Continues in a moment. You stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. My next guest is a member of the Congregation of Holy Cross, and in just a matter of days, he and his brethren will celebrate the canonization of one of their own, Blessed Andre Bessette. On Sunday, Pope Benedict XVI will raise this humble brother to the altars of the Church. Brother Andre is a cultural and spiritual icon in Canada, especially in his native Quebec. But his story isn't necessarily known widely outside of Canada. Here to discuss Brother Andre's life and the impact of his canonization, please welcome the Director of Pastoral Services at St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, Father Charles Corso. Father, thank you for being here.
Hello.
I want to start with what impact he's having, Brother Andre's pending canonization. How are the people in Quebec, the secular Quebec, responding, and why?
Certainly the secular media are picking up this story and running with it. They are interested because a person doesn't get canonized every day in the church, and certainly not a Canadian. So the people here are, I think, are aware that, well, if I can use a bit of a metaphor, it's kind of like the Olympics. One of our people made it.
So there's a hometown pride here.
Yeah, I'd say so. But of course, Brother Andre's influence, even while he was alive, spread all over Quebec into the United States, particularly in the eastern part, northeast part of the country. And as it turns out, Brother Andre's family, all of his brothers and sisters eventually moved to the United States. He's the only one who stayed in Canada.
Wow. Father, talk for a moment about the humble nature of this man. I mean, he was a brother, he wasn't a priest, and he came from a very poor background. He was illiterate, right?
You know, I didn't know that till I came to the oratory to work 4 years ago. He was virtually illiterate. Well, we would call it today functionally illiterate his whole life. And yet he became a member of a teaching order of brothers. So that's why they made him the doorkeeper. He couldn't teach in the classroom, so he was the factotum. around the Collège Notre Dame. He ran errands. He washed the floors. But as doorkeeper, he received the children coming in the morning and their parents, and when they would leave at night. And it was the parents and the visitors who were just taken by his personality.
Mm-hmm. He was born in 1845 in Montreal. He died in 1937 at the age of 91. Talk to us about his spirituality. I mean, he was regarded as a healer. People would go to him for healings. Tell us about that aspect of his life and his spiritual mission.
His spirituality was very simple. Pray to St. Joseph. He learned to pray to St. Joseph at his mother's knee, and he became a Holy Cross brother, where St. Joseph is the patron of the brothers. So it was that simple. He had an absolute confidence in God and in the power of God to teach, to reach people, to touch their lives. Now, as far as the healer is concerned, like I think happens in a number of people who are given the charism of healing, it happened. You know, it wasn't as though he sought it. It happened. He discovered that he knew people were going to get better, and he told them that, and they did.
Hmm. I mean, but Father, he didn't just heal a few people. He wasn't involved, rather, in the healing of a few people. I read a Time magazine piece where they mentioned 15,000 people a year. That's a pretty hefty number.
I'm not sure that we would say that was the number of cures. He probably saw that many people. You know, once the small oratory was built, they built an office for him to receive the people who came. And there could be easily 300 to 400 people who would line up every day to see him. And when they would approach him in the office, he had such simple things to say. Why don't you make a novena to St. Joseph? Or go to confession and receive Holy Communion, then come back to see me. So he was never a highfalutin theologian. He was actually, he wasn't born in Montreal. He was born in a rural parish. And he was kind of a hick from the sticks, can I use that expression? All his life. He was this bluff. He was a bluff, hearty guy. And he was full of humor, loved to joke with people, though when he was with people he didn't know, he was reserved. But when he was with people he knew, it was a laugh riot. And we all this we have through testimonies made through the process of canonization. Because he didn't write anything. He was, as you say, illiterate. He wrote no books.
It made the studying of his, I'm sure it made the studying of his writings and thoughts very quick and easy, right?
That's right. If you want to be a saint, be illiterate.
That's right. I like that. But, you know, as I read his story, though, the constant suffering he went through, terrible physical maladies throughout his whole life, you know, it sort of recalled this Mother Angelica-like figure as well. You know, somebody who's kind of personally going through suffering, a simple person of the people, of the street, who relates spirituality that's so needed. Is that the message for secular Quebec and the wider world?
You just made my pitch for me. That's exactly it, Raymond. That people, particularly here, he's one of our own. He was a man of the soil, ordinary person. He never lost that common touch. He was not a highfalutin theologian. He didn't preach great rallies. He received people one by one, and he listened to them, and he told them how to love God. One of his associates said one time he spent his whole life talking to others about God and to God about others.
Beautiful line. Beautiful line. Father, tell me what this will mean personally to you all, to your congregation of the Holy Cross, and to you personally and your priesthood.
Of course, Brother Andre is the first Holy Cross member of the Congregation of Holy Cross to be canonized. The founder of the congregation, Father Moreau, has been beatified. And there are recently several other Holy Cross priests and brothers whose causes have been introduced, most notably Father Peyton, the Rosary Man.
Of course.
So for us, there's that exhilaration, of the spirituality that Father Moreau put forth proved to be advantageous. And it was available to Andre, and it's available to me as a priest. I'm thrilled because years ago, even when I was in the seminary, I knew the story of Andre, and he attracted me greatly. So to be here in Canada, I am an American, but I'm on loan from the United States to Canada. To be here at this time is extraordinarily gratifying for me.
Yeah, what a great moment. And of course, we will be watching. We'll be bringing people live coverage of the event. But if you'd like more information about Brother Andre, you can visit the Father's website at brotherandre.org. And if you'd like more information on St. Joseph's Oratory of Mount Royal in Montreal, visit saint-joseph-joseph.org/en for English. Thank you so much, Father, for being with us, and we'll all be watching the canonization this week.
Fine.
Thank you, Father. And you can catch this weekend's canonization of Brother Andre Bessette and Blessed Mary MacKillop of Australia and several others right here on EWTN live this Sunday, October 17th at 4 a.m. Eastern Time. And for those of you who are not insomniacs, we will be running an encore at noon Eastern Time that same day. Well, that's all the time we have. Until next week, you can find updates and the occasional commentary by following me on Twitter at twitter.com/Raymond Arroyo or on my Facebook fan page. You can always find me at raymondarroyo.com. The book I edited for Mother Angelica, The Prayers and Personal Devotions of Mother Angelica, are available at bookstores everywhere. And next week, I'm going to tell you about an exciting new dramatized Bible project that I recently produced. It's called the Truth and Life Audio Bible. It's pretty special, but I'll unveil that next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now.